I stopped praying to God, and this is who actually answered. You've been praying your whole life. Maybe you still do. You were told it was the path, the direct line between you and something greater than yourself. Bow your head, fold your hands, speak your need, and wait for an answer. And maybe it worked sometimes, or maybe it felt like leaving a voicemail for someone you weren't sure was listening. But here's the question nobody in the institution ever asked out loud. What if the very structure of prayer, the kneeling, the petitioning, the pleading, what if that posture was never meant to connect you to the divine? What if it was designed, whether consciously or not, to keep you at a distance from it? I'm not talking about personal faith. I'm not talking about the genuine raw 3 a.m. cry when nothing else is left. I'm talking about the system, the architecture, the way organized religion has framed the relationship between a human being and the sacred, as one between a subject and a sovereign, a creature and its creator. A broken thing and the whole thing that made it. There is a tradition, ancient. 106. 1 minute, 6. Deliberately buried, systematically attacked, that described a completely different kind of relationship. Not petition, not performance, something else entirely. Something that certain early communities practiced before the councils decided they were dangerous. This is what I want to walk you through today. What they knew, what was suppressed, and what it changes if it's true. I'm Daniel and this is Gnostic Library. Let's start with what prayer actually is structurally. Not spiritually, structurally. Because when you strip away the devotion and look at the mechanics, something interesting emerges. Prayer in its most common institutional form assumes a gap. There is you here insufficient and in need, and there is God there complete and capable. The act of prayer is the act of crossing that gap or trying to. You send a request across the distance and hope something comes back. Now, that might sound like I'm being reductive. I'm not. I'm being precise. Because that assumption, the gap, the distance, the fundamental separation between the human and the divine, is exactly what the Gnostic tradition identified as the core problem, not the solution. The Gnostics had a word for the force responsible for that illusion of separation. They called it the Demiurge. Not God in the ultimate sense, but a lesser limited creator entity that fashioned the material world and in doing so created the conditions for human beings to forget what they actually were. The Demiurge isn't evil in a cartoonish way. It's more like a warden who genuinely believes the prison is the whole world. This is laid out with startling clarity in the Apocryphon of John, a text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, likely dating to the 2nd century. In it, the divine realm, what the Gnostics called the pleioma, the fullness, is described as infinitely removed from material existence. And human beings are described as divine sparks, fragments of that original fullness, trapped inside matter and made to forget their origin. Here's where it gets cosmically significant. If that's the cosmology, if the human being is actually a fragment of the divine that has forgotten itself, then what does prayer do within that framework? It reinforces the forgetting. Every time you petition an external God for rescue, you are rehearsing the belief that you are separate from the source. You are practicing the amnesia. Now, here's where it gets institutionally interesting. I spent several weeks once working through the writings of Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, who wrote his famous treatise against heresies around 180 CE. His arguments against the Gnostics are meticulous, often furious, and reveal something crucial. He wasn't primarily concerned that Gnostics were worshipping the wrong thing. He was concerned that they weren't worshipping through the church. The danger he kept circling back to wasn't theological. It was structural. Gnostic communities had no need for priests as mediators. No need for sacraments administered by authorized clergy. No need for an institution standing between the individual and the sacred. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening. Just saying. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's false, but because it's threatening to its own necessity, you're looking at suppressed truth. That's the tell. One viewer wrote, and this hit me hard. I've prayed for 30 years and the only times I felt truly close to anything sacred were the moments I stopped talking and just existed. I read that 3 times because that person had stumbled onto something without a framework to name it. The tradition we're talking about today would have given them that framework. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, puts it this way. Those who say God is in the sky, the birds will get there first. Those who say God is in the sea, the fish will get there first. What the text is pointing at in its oblique, frustrating, extraordinary way is that looking outward for the divine is category error. The thing you're looking for is not out there. It is the thing that is looking. So if prayer as an architecture reinforces the gap it claims to be crossing, what did the Gnostic tradition say to do instead? Before I can answer that, I have to take you somewhere conceptually. And I'm asking you to stay with me because this is the piece that changes everything. The Gnostics had a name for the ultimate reality, the source before the source, the ground beneath the pleroma itself. They called it the monad. And the monad is not God in any way you've been taught to think about God. It doesn't rule. It doesn't judge. It doesn't hear prayers. The Apocryphon of John describes it like this. The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is pure light which no eye can behold. Sit with that for a second. Pure light which no eye can behold. Not because it's hidden, but because the eye that would behold it is made of it. Here's the analogy that finally cracked it open for me. Imagine the ocean. Now imagine a wave. The wave is real. It has height, movement, form, energy. It crashes. It recedes. It does everything a wave does. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. It never was. When the wave asks the ocean for something, what is it actually doing? It's performing a relationship that doesn't reflect what it fundamentally is. The wave is the ocean temporarily surfaced into a particular shape. The Gnostic understanding of the human being is exactly this. You are not a creature made by God and therefore distantly related to God. You are, according to these texts, a self-expression of the monad, an individuated movement of the source itself. The divine isn't something you reach toward. It's what you are under the layer of forgetting. Now, here's the question the tradition raises once you accept that cosmology. If you are an expression of the monad, what's the appropriate spiritual act? Not petition. Not pleading, something they called recognition, or in a more active formulation, the monad call. Not asking the divine to intervene from outside, declaring the identity that was never actually lost. I want to be precise about what happened when I first encountered this. I'd been studying the Troarthic Protoninoa, a remarkable text, probably 3rd century, in which the divine feminine speaks in the first person about descending into the world 3 times to awaken the sleeping divine sparks trapped in matter. I spent the better part of a Saturday just sitting with the opening lines. The divine says, I am the voice that appeared through my thought. I am the one who is called life. I am the movement that dwells in the all. And something shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way I can dress up for effect, just something that had been held at arm's length suddenly. Wasn't. Not because I discovered a new religious fact, because the text was describing something interior I'd felt and had no language for. That's what Gnosis is, by the way. not the accumulation of esoteric information, not knowing about the Demiurge or being able to name the archons. Knowledge, direct, interior, unmediated. That's not Gnosis. Knowing the word Gnosis, that's just a library card. As I covered in my video on what the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas actually teaches, the tradition is less interested in belief systems than in transformative recognition. You can believe every doctrine correctly and still be entirely asleep. And you can encounter one sentence in an ancient text at the right moment and something wakes up. The Gnostic practice, and it was a practice, not just a philosophy, was built around cultivating that recognition. Ritual in these communities wasn't about appeasing a deity. It was about remembering. The ceremonies described in texts like the Gospel of Philip weren't petitions. They were structured experiences designed to dissolve the amnesia to make the wave remember it is the ocean. There's a specific phrase in the Pistis Sophia, a later sprawling Gnostic text, that stays with me. It describes the divine spark within each person as the light that cries out from within matter. Not a light that arrives from outside when prayer is answered. A light already present, already crying out, already attempting to surface through the thickness of forgetting. What that means practically, and this is where the tradition becomes genuinely radical, is that the spiritual crisis most people experience isn't a problem of insufficient devotion. It isn't that they haven't prayed hard enough or believed clearly enough. It's that they're looking in the wrong direction, outward instead of inward, upward instead of through. Where prayer emphasizes humility and need, the monad call emphasizes recognition and identity. Where prayer asks, the monad call declares. Think about what that means for a moment. You are not requesting access to something you lack. You are remembering something you already are. So what does 1 second this look like in practice? Because I'm not interested in leaving this at the level of cosmological poetry. The Gnostic tradition wasn't either. The communities that practiced around these texts before Irenaeus and the councils that followed him systematically disbanded them weren't operating on vague spiritual intuition. They had specific techniques, specific orientations. And while the full ritual architecture didn't survive the book burnings intact, what did survive tells us enough. First, they inverted the direction of attention. Prayer points outward and upward toward a God conceived as elsewhere. Gnostic practice consistently points inward toward the divine spark understood as already present. The Dialogue of the Savior, another Nag Hammadi text, frames it as a question of awareness. Not what am I aware of, but who is aware? The subject of consciousness, not its objects. The light doing the seeing, not what it illuminates. Second, they treated understanding as transformative rather than merely informational. Snorts, this is why Gnosis is not the same as intellectual knowledge. Reading about the monad doesn't constitute a monad call. The text has to reach something interior. It has to land in the part of you that was already asking without language. When it does, when that recognition fires, that's the event the tradition was pointing toward.